Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Humanities and Social Sciences Library here at the University of Oslo, both in the house and in front of your screens. My name is Astrid Andersson. I'm the manager of the research section here at the library. And we are very happy to host this panel on the past, present, and future of Black Lives Matter. It is part of our mission as an academic library to promote knowledge and inclusion, and we wanted to contribute to the momentum of the anti-racism movement by arranging this event. We have invited panel participants who have raised the awareness of these issues in very different ways. And before we begin, I have to remind you who are present in the house about the corona precautions we are taking. All audience members have to register by filling out a form on your seats or by scanning the QR code. And antibac and face masks are available at the table over there. And in addition, please remember to keep at least 1 meter's distance when you leave your seats. I will now afterwards turn the microphone over to moderator of the panel, Professor Randall J. Stevens. Before that, I have to also thank our dear colleagues from Oslo Met who are helping us stream this event on Zoom, or wherever it's streamed. Professor Stevens Randall, he is a professor of American and British Studies at the University of Oslo. He has previously taught at universities in the UK and the US. He's a historian of religion, conservatism, the South, environmentalism, and popular culture. And in addition to his scholarly work, he has written for The Atlantic, Salon, The Independent, The Chronicle of Higher Education, The Washington Post, and The New York Times. Randall, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and for those of you who are seeing this streamed. We're going to get right into it because we're going to try to get into a fun conversation, lightning conversation about this, I think. So I want to introduce our panelists. Rebecca Scherr is sitting across from me. She's a professor in American literature at the University of Oslo. In her teaching and research, she uses literature by writers of color and the insights of critical race studies to both trace the history and development of the racial caste system in the United States, as well as tracing the ways that colonial systems of thought and action continue to shape the world. Then we have Michelle A. Tisdel, a social anthropologist and research librarian at the National Library of Norway. Tisdel holds a doctorate in social anthropology from Harvard University. Her research interests include cultural policy, heritage production museums, material culture, Afro-Cuban religions, and other matters. Her publications include her dissertation, Cuban Museums and Afro-Cuban Heritage Fragments and Transitions in Daily Life, 2006, a book chapter, 3 Interpretations of Materiality in Society, Afro-Cuban Heritage, and the Cuban Slave Route Museum. She's also the co-editor, one of the co-editors of the 2020 publication, A Literary Anthropology of Migration and Belonging, with Cecilia, is it?
Fagerli.
Fagerli,
Yeah.
Okay. And she's a contributor to the book Cultural Contestation, Heritage Identity, and the Role of Government, 2018. And finally, she is a board member of the Museum I Akershus and board leader of the new organization, INN, and I'll try not to butcher this, but Etniske minoriteter I norsk kulturliv. And then finally, we have Raha Telehun Johannes, sitting right here, is the political advisor of the African Student Association, ASA. She is the founder of Manifold Norway, an organization dedicated to promoting diversity and positive changes in society, with a particular focus on youth and women. Johannes is also an activist, co-organizer, and spokesperson for the ASA during the Black Lives Matter events in Oslo recently. And I wonder if we could start off with each of the participants giving a short, maybe a 5-minute summary of their view of the meaning and significance of Black Lives Matter. Anybody want to start us off, or?
I guess I'll start. I'm sorry, you say like the
Sort of the meaning of it for you and
for me.
Mm-hmm.
I think Black Lives Matter is a global movement that is relevant everywhere, not just in the United States or Norway, but everywhere, including Africa, the continent, and the Caribbean, where Black people are. Black Lives Matter is relevant. It's about equity for me. Mostly it's about getting access to the same things as the rest of the population gets. It's about distributive justice, and it's about historical justice. I think it has its skeptics, but I think people, if they just listen and open their eyes to the problems that we have in our society, I think they'll understand that this is an important movement.
Thank you.
Also I find it's quite interesting because if you recall, the Black Lives Matter movement started off as a fairly local response to, it was in 2013 when George Zimmerman was acquitted for the murder of Trayvon Martin. That's when Black Lives Matter started. Like so many things today, it started as a hashtag and grew into a movement. And it's just been interesting to watch the development of Black Lives Matter over the past 7 years and the way that the meaning of the movement has shifted and changed and expanded with the times. In 2013, in the beginning, it was a lot about addressing police brutality. Of course, police brutality against African Americans, especially African American men, is something that has existed throughout American history, but it was bringing a very kind of specific focus to this phenomenon that says so much more about what I call the racial caste system in America. And it's just been interesting to watch because, like Arawa was just saying, it's gone from something quite local, addressing police brutality, and in the very beginning, addressing things like getting cameras. They're talking with the police, trying to get police to use body cameras in their arrests, and actual successful lobbying in doing such things. And then with time and the continued violence of the police against African American communities, we see this explosion, this kind of defining moment with George Floyd just this year, where the movement itself starts to take on this global resonance, where people are really engaging with not just police violence, that's kind of the beginning, that's the spark, but all these larger issues that have to do with the kind of civil rights questions of our time, like you were talking about, justice, equity, things that have clearly not been addressed properly, and now there's this grand swelling, this grand demand. I remember it was really interesting right after the protests in Minneapolis and in the United States. I was listening to a podcast. It was the Ezra Klein podcast with Ta-Nehisi Coates. And Coates was asked by Klein, like, how is this different from, for example, 1968 with Martin Luther King? And Coates talked about how he called his father and asked, what is the difference now? And his father said, oh, it's so much bigger now. If you remember in 68, most white people in America, they didn't like Martin Luther King. And now we have all these protests happening with George Floyd, and there's this groundswell of people, from white people, other people of color, African Americans. His father had never seen anything like it in terms of people coming together in a sort of great solidarity around issues of racial injustice. And so he saw it as actually this great defining moment. And I think that Black Lives Matter is that kind of building on that momentum that we have seen. So I think it's interesting to trace its development and what it says, not just about America, but then how that, as you're putting it, starts to speak to a larger global interest in questions of justice.
Thank you. Michelle?
Okay, I prepared remarks, of course. You guys sound so cool talking off the cuff. I didn't do that in any language, so I have prepared my 5 minutes. So first I'd like to say that, of course, there have been many movements that I would put under the same headline as Black Lives Matter. I would say that the abolitionist movement to end slavery was a Black Lives Matter movement. I would say that all of the slave revolts were expressions of Black Lives Matter movements. And of course, the more traditional social movements like the civil rights movement and everything in between, the 100 years between emancipation and receiving the right to vote in the United States. You know, those whole 100 years that we were not slaves, but we were not citizens. So that's been one long Black Lives Matter movement, you know, since 1619, I would say. Even if it was just one person expressing the sentiment that I don't want to be a slave. I mean, that could be considered an expression of, you know, what was to come in terms of having a movement for Black lives. Another thing that I would like to mention, and particularly here for a Norwegian audience, is that the Black Lives Matter movement is an umbrella. There are more than 80 organizations in something called the Movement for Black Lives. So it's kind of hard to differentiate sometimes because we just say Black Lives Matter movement. We have to differentiate between the slogan and the sentiment, Black Lives Matter, and then the actual movement, which is the Movement for Black Lives, which the organization Black Lives Matter is one organization that belongs to an umbrella organization, and it's not even, I should say, a coalition, where a lot of groups that have similar goals are together, and the slogan Black Lives Matter has just become so powerful, and it encompasses and expresses so well the sentiment that it has become kind of the dominant slogan. But there are many organizations, and it's called, one can refer to the Movement for Black Lives, of which the Black Lives Matter organization is one. Also, I think that something that has occurred since the summer that concerns me, but that I think we need to address and we need to be aware of, is this notion that activism, I hear murmuring of activism suddenly not being something positive, that, you know, the activists are sullying or, making more trouble than they are doing good, and that identity politics is now threatening freedom of expression. And these new conversations that are emerging, that somehow there's a conflict between advocating for your visibility and your representation and social justice that's related to your identity, meaning your history, a history of injustice, which has become part of one's identity, that somehow advocating for that and insisting on having more space in the public dialogue is a threat to freedom of speech, or is compromising the ytringsrommet. So that's another conversation that's emerging that I think we have to keep our eyes on and be aware of, and be able to differentiate and ask questions. Okay, well, what does it mean? What do you mean when you say freedom of speech is being threatened? What do you mean when you say there's less space in the ytringsrom? What do you mean exactly? Is it just in discomfort? Are there more people in the ytringsrom? Are people taking more space? Or are some people actually being excluded on the grounds of, because you're white, you can't speak? So because that is the implication that's my interpretation of what I'm hearing, is that identity politics is creating the effect of saying to certain people, you can't be part of the conversation. So that's my next point, is that I am also very concerned, as you are, that we are losing our focus on, we're not losing, I would like us to keep and increase the focus on dialogue and on helping, spreading information, sharing information, and talking about the right issues in this big field of very rightly so emotionally charged issues, and it should be emotionally charged. There's another emerging dialogue that, the activism is so irrational because it's all emotionally charged. It's not logic. People are not using logic. They're not using facts. It's all about emotions, and that's what drives identity politics. I disagree with that. And I think there are very different kinds of activism. There are different contexts where in one context you may be focusing on emotion, and in another conversation, another context, you may focus on facts, and you may talk about what the facts mean, what are real facts, what are historical facts, what does it mean to want to bring in new historical narratives and impose those historical narratives on the general population. That's part of the conversation of identity politics. If you want to teach decolonization or feminism or anti-racism or social justice, then that can be described as ideology. So again, we just have to keep the focus on the right issues, and we have to insist on spread and exchange of information, and be less focused on that we're going to change people's attitudes or convince someone of something that they maybe don't have enough information and awareness to believe as fact as such. So those are some of the things that I want to say. How did we get here? Where do we want to go? Are we all looking in the right direction? Are we in the same direction when we talk about where we want to go with this conversation, what the goals are, et cetera? And you probably won't get a lot of disagreement in this conversation today, because I support very much what both of you said. And I have some other ideas I'd like to share, but I'll try to bring them out in the course of the conversation, because that was probably 5 minutes, right?
I think it might have been less, but I have a question here about that's related. It was a good segue actually to this question about, which we've sort of, I think, addressed a little bit and circled around, but to what degree do you all think that Black Lives Matter and discussions about racial justice in the US and elsewhere are influencing conversations and influencing activism in Norway right now?
Oh, okay.
I'm looking to you.
I guess I'm
Yes.
going to start now. All right. Well, let's just start with the fact that we are living in the age of information, where it's very easy to access everything that's going on in the world, unless you're very selective. But also, if you look for it, you'll find it. The influence part, I'm not really sure. Of course, when something happens, it has a ripple effect, and it tends to catch on to other places as well. But I think in terms of the influence, of course, when someone dies across the ocean and that person looks like you, and you know the roots of why they're dying or the roots of why people are being oppressed, it really doesn't take much to react and find ways to demand justice where you are as well. Because I think in terms of activism, you can't do global activism as one individual or a group of people. It has to be, you have to have your own local enclaves where you sort of do what you can. So it does influence it, but at the same time, these are things that we, maybe it came to light because a lot of people came out this summer, but these are things that we've been talking about for years. And it's very easy to find out about things when it's trending. Of course, then people catch on, but if you really put in the work, then it's very easy to see that there are many groups of people that are discussing this on a regular basis. There are many groups of people that are doing the work and putting in the labor to change things everywhere. So the influence is, we kind of took it upon ourselves to do something here because, we have our own case of police brutality and police profiling issues in Norway. So yeah, it's very easy to address it. But we also had a person that was killed here in 2006, Eugene Obiora. Ejike Obiora. We had Benjamin Hermansen, although he was killed by neo-Nazis. And people are being attacked. I mean, I don't know, it's on the news, people are being attacked, even though not by the police, but by civilians, because of racism, because of Islamophobia, because of many different reasons. But like, it's racism is racism. At the end of the day, of course, we had a demonstration about anti-blackness this summer, but it's a larger issue that everyone that is of color and those that have opened their eyes to it see on a daily basis. So yeah, it influenced the momentum, but it did not influence the motivation.
Mhm.
So that's my answer.
Thank you. Rebecca?
Yeah, of course you're coming from the activist perspective. I think I can add something from the perspective of someone who deals with these issues in the classroom and the influence of America and American sort of conceptions of how to talk about race and racism and how that affects Norway and how that can have some kind of influence. And this is just from my experience as a teacher. I do teach American literature. When I teach multicultural literature from an American perspective, I introduce material that it comes from critical race studies. And it's based in an American context, but it's very interesting because what I find that a lot of what happens in all of these classes, every time I teach it, is that we start from an American context. There's a kind of vocabulary. There are many, many scholars and others who have worked on this issue and provide a kind of framework for discussion. They provide vocabulary that might not actually exist in Norwegian. Nevertheless, Norwegian students of color, white Norwegians, all of that, they recognize something in the way that Americans talk about how racism operates, both in a, in a sort of physical way where it comes to people getting assaulted, attacked like you're talking about, but also the structures of thinking and how prejudice works and how minds are organized, how people are taught to have prejudices and discrimination against others. So what I find is that Norwegian students can often really resonate with some of these ideas. Many of them then take those ideas and they reformulate them, or you work with them in some ways to make it more applicable to what they see happening around them in a Norwegian context. And I think that's what's happening a lot, both in the activist movement and in other movements here in Norway, is that they find a vocabulary. You have a groundswell of people who have worked on these issues in the United States, who have published these issues and made them widely available for people to grasp, both on social media, but also publications and so forth. So I find there's an interesting way in which the ideas coming from America can actually give some Norwegians a way to start talking about these in a constructive manner and in a way that makes sense to them and their own experiences. So it's very fascinating to watch how these ideas get passed over, how they get globalized, and also how they become quite specific to the circumstances in which they find themselves. So the way that Norwegians can make sense of this.
Thank you. Michelle?
I think that was a great question. And it allows me to talk about something that I've become obsessed with over the past couple of days since I saw a program on television where they were discussing different current topics in relation to freedom of expression. And your question was, what's happening in the U.S., how does it perhaps influence what's the Norwegian context and the dialogue that's occurring here? I would like to say that, there's a history of a civil rights movement here in Norway. There's a history of, let's call it a civil rights movement in Norway, but it's not really perceived as being a movement about civil rights because we know that the Norwegian Constitution has a very strong likestilling or equality discourse, and there are several laws and the principles, the democratic principles are in place. However, there still has been a civil rights movement in Norway from the point of view of certain minority communities. They have done consistent work since the late 60s in trying to gain access and gain equal rights in relation to ethnic Norwegians. You know, the first generation of migrants who came to Norway did a lot of work to advocate for fairness in housing, employment contracts, and a whole range of policies. And there was a demonstration in 1976 in October in the streets of Oslo, an anti-racism demonstration. You had organizations called Fremmed Arbeiderforening, and which was a coalition, an international, it had international members, and they did a lot of organizing to get rights for workers, and all sorts of, there's all sorts of things that have been going on here in Norway that are very similar and that have all of the attributes of being a social movement about social justice and anti-racism. There's even written a dissertation about this, a PhD dissertation about the anti-racist movement in Norway, where, and I'm sorry I don't remember the name of the author, but I can provide that information later, where the author talks about, he argues and establishes, talks about new social movements and why the anti-racism movement in Norway can be defined and understood as a new social movement, and I say a civil rights movement, and then he talks about the different actors, who are the different kinds of organizations and people who contributed to the anti-racism movement in Norway in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, right? So even in Norway, what were they doing? Why were they making a social movement if there were not conditions that required them to do that? So there's that part, and then when you come to like the 1990s and an organization, you know, the organization OMOD, it used to be called Organisasjon mot offentlig diskriminering, but now I think it's called like the Center for Social Justice, or Organization for Social Justice. But they, Aki de Leon, who was one of the founders of that organization, they did a lot of work, documentation work in the 90s, documenting citizens' encounters with police, having dialogue meetings with the police and with different authorities, mostly in Oslo, but the influence has spread to around the country. And their goal, for example, was to, to get the police to write a receipt every time they did a control on someone, because people with minority background were experiencing being stopped a lot. And so it was basically racial profiling, and it took a very long time. They collected statements from people. They did the work of documenting people's experiences, collecting the information, taking the information to the authorities, having lots of contact with the authorities, and then through that information, you know, talking about recruitment in the police academy, you know, talking about racism in the utelivsbransjen. You know, why do they not let us go into a club? You know, all very basic things that influence people's quality of life. And what it points to, the reason why it's important, is that feelings of vulnerability, of non-belonging, of being targeted for or overvåket, surveilled, and those kinds of feelings. Those are similarities to a lot of the experiences that people who have been marginalized experience all over the world. So it's certain aspects of discrimination are very similar across societies, and that is why I think that it has resonated here in Norway. The last thing I'd like to say about that is that I heard the term on the television about a week ago, sneak amerikanisering. It was the question they were talking about, there was the same question, is this, the charge has been made on several occasions by different people in different places that the dialogue here in Norway is influenced by the situation, the context in the United States, that we are importing discourses and importing arguments to describe what's happening in Norway, and that it doesn't match the situation. And I think that is a horrible cognitive dissonance that is occurring on this subject, because there's plenty of information about how life was for new people in Norway that show us that there were obviously challenges. And the documentary that was on television the other day about the slave, which was actually described, the Norwegians, Norway's role in the transatlantic slave trade, also gives us a historical context to talk about, why this is not just a sneak Amerikanisering. Norwegians of color have a basis and a right and a legitimate claims to make about how they want to be and belong in Norwegian society. And they don't have to use American discourses to justify that. They have their own discourses that are legitimate enough.
Thank you.
May I add something to
Yeah,
that?
sure, please.
Yeah, historical contexts are very important, and I think that's something that we've been trying very hard to kind of like bring to light. Among the things decolonizing academia, which Rebecca was very outspoken about and did her part, and that's also something that can be, traced back to Black Lives Matter movement, because it's about the contributions of Black and brown and indigenous scholars. I mean, Black people are also indigenous, but just to include everybody. The contribution of such scholars are important. They matter. Their perspectives matter, because it's not a Euronormative way of seeing things. It's very important to, but that also was turned into a problem about identity politics. There's nothing wrong with identity politics. Feminism was identity politics, is identity politics. We're still fighting for it to, have equal justice for both men and women in many ways. So, going back to the social justice and police profiling, we handed in a letter to the Justice Department right after the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, signed by Arise, African Student Association, and the Center for Social Justice, UMUD. And we are yet to hear from the Justice Minister, and it was very much addressed to her. But she's very swift on, banning people from coming into the country that might contribute to, hate something? That it is as a follow-up of the current, global environment in terms of the Islam and the West's conflict. So it just shows you what priorities look like in terms of where some departments are doing things. And our letter wasn't too much of a claim, too much of a demand. What we asked for is just basically a law that was passed in, or an agreement that was passed in the parliament, or Stortinget here in Norway, after it has gone 3 rounds about the police profiling and the kvitteringsordning, or the receipts. That was sabotaged in 2003 from actually being run a pilot project on. We just wanted it to be implemented. We didn't say, hey, implement something that didn't go through the parliament 3 times. We just want that to be implemented so that we can show that this is an actual problem. But we still haven't heard it. Of course, we're gonna, send an inquiry, but I just think it just kind of dawned on me when you mentioned it, sorry.
Also, when you were talking, I was thinking about the way in which these kinds of issues are discussed in the kind of Norwegian public forum, the general forum, and this constant weaponization of terms like identity politics, sneak Amerikanisering, or what it's called. So what happens is that they're already used as kind of ideological weapons to try to discredit anti-racist work and to actually deflect from exactly what you were talking about, which is the whole history of civil rights movements in Norway with a Norwegian basis. If we can use these terms which seem, a lot of people who don't know the history will be like, oh yeah, identity politics, bad, Americanization, bad. It basically derails the entire conversation or any kind of openness or curiosity about why are people using these terms? Where do they come from? Why are they important now? What is important to people? So I just feel like these terms are constantly being weaponized, like the term woke. Also, if people use it, it's just a weapon, right, to tear people down.
Yeah.
So I think really also having conversations about the kind of terminology that's being used in the public sphere is very, very important, because there's a lot of deflection to the real issues going on. And what I find very strange and interesting now today in Norway, it seems like a lot of people are much more interested in attacking anti-racists in a public forum and showing how they're wrong or bad or too American or racist themselves by being anti-racist. I'm never quite sure how that argument runs, but we hear it all the time. While a lot of these people are not interested at all in the actual racism that's happening both in Norway and the larger world. They never talk about that, but there's this very keen interest in somehow weaponizing these terms and basically sort of taking over the public sphere and controlling the conversation.
Yes. It is a power play to regain control of the conversation. And to that point, it's like this whole thing about whether the Norwegian dialogue is becoming, the polarization in the Norwegian dialogue is a consequence of taking cues from the US. Why can't the polarization in the Norwegian dialogue just be about the Norwegian society and the Norwegian actors engaging in the conversation? I'm not being an apologist for Americans or the United States. I'm merely saying that by using arguments, when someone suggests that the Norwegian conversation is being influenced by imported American or other sentiments, then that is indirectly using a form of Norwegian exceptionalism, saying that the conversation here can't become polarized on its own merely by the fact of the nature of the subject, and the fact that everyone here is using social media just like in other places. People here are inside their bubbles talking to each other, just like, we're behaving the same way here we behave in other places. That doesn't mean that the other place is dominating your conversation here in Norway. It just means that, guess what? Norway is like other places. That's what that means. It's not that complicated. There is a conversation tomorrow at the National Museum as part of the Black History Month markering, and they have invited some people to speak about Black history, but also about how the museum is addressing representation through their work. So on the event in Facebook, as I was checking the information yesterday, a person in the public, a member of the public, wrote that they were very disappointed that the National Museum was, using a public institution of the common good in order to focus on Black history. And they said that this was evidence of the institution kneeling to Black identity politics in Norway. So that sentiment is not just coming, that's just an example of that same sentiment it's not just what I heard in that particular news program or that broadcast that I was looking at. That comment from Facebook also kind of resonated in the sense that if you want to talk about Black history or Norwegian Black history or the Norwegian diaspora's history, the African diaspora's history in Norway, then suddenly you're engaging in identity politics. Last thing I'll say is, what people forget is, or what people don't realize often is that if these histories and realities were taught in general as part of general education, then we wouldn't have to have an identity politics that focuses specifically on my history or your history or women's history or people with funktionshemmings history. Because if we taught their history, if it was a part of our general teaching, then we wouldn't have to have a special focus on it. So we just have to like switch, flip it, turn it upside down and look at it from the other perspective. You know, why did it emerge? Instead of criticizing that it exists, we need to ask ourselves, how did we get here? Why did people start to focus on their own history? Then we can kind of untangle some of this, I think. Thank you for your patience listening to my...
Thank you.
I just had to get it out. Thanks.
I was just going to say one thing. Some of this reminds me of, I do some work on the American South during the Civil Rights Movement, and the language of outside agitators was usually used to shut down conversations and to shut down the movement. Because you could say, these people aren't really from here, they're coming from the north, and we know our situation. I don't think that's a really too direct of a parallel, but there is a way to sort of say, we don't have to abide by these things because it's an outsider who's making these points. So to shift to something that's not controversial at all, the election that's coming up next week, and I think many Americans are having panic attacks right now. So it's less than a week away, and it obviously will be one of the most important ones in modern U.S. history, and it throws up all sorts of issues about a fair election and disinformation campaigns and bad faith and on and on. But I wonder if you could reflect on what sort of issues those who are part of the social justice movement and Black Lives Matter will face, depending on, we don't really know, what is going to happen next week. But I wanted to see if maybe you could reflect on it's hard to talk about the future in a way, because obviously we don't know, but what sort of is at stake and what we can maybe expect.
Am I starting again? Okay.
Yes, you are.
No, so are we speaking from the Black Lives Matter or the movement for Black Lives perspective, or are we speaking from a more policymaker's point of view?
Either
Yeah.
is fine.
Well, it depends on who's elected into office, really, because, but the thing is, African Americans in general have very low trust in the government because they don't think the government works in their interest, and this is backed up by research. But I think either way, I think they would be much better off if it's a Democratic majority in the House and Senate and a Democratic president. But from the movement's perspective, I think, hopefully anyway, people will work harder to implement measurable solutions for their own movement. Because, yeah, protests are nice. They're a very good way of showing that they're tired. They're not taking this systemic oppression anymore. But at the same time, it's very important that Black people and African Americans and all the Black people in the US get together and sort of work to make sure that they're represented everywhere. Work to make sure that they have their own interests represented by their own people, because most of the times it's, well, the majority or white people making policies for them that they don't even understand what kind of struggles people are going through. They don't even live in this in the communities that are being targeted by police and different harmful institutions, but they're very comfortable in making policies for them. And the only way that can change is if they take the space themselves. Of course, that's not very easy when especially people are voting mainly because they hate the other group of people and not because they actually care about what kind of policies are going to be implemented through the government. So it's not issue voting that has been taking place in the past 4 years. It's mostly, I hate the other group, so I hope they lose, and that's why I'm voting for the other guy. And thank you for validating my racist feelings. And, things like that. So I think they should work more towards organizing themselves and working for their own interest. And the NAACP is not enough. I think other organizations need to also get involved.
I'm nervous. I want this all to be over. Of course, I'm one of the people having panic attacks on a daily basis. But when I sort of go through in my mind all the various scenarios in my head, the one thing I'm most nervous about, at least in the sort of the very immediate future, is if Trump somehow wins or cheats his way into, through the courts and various things, into maintaining the office. What I'm worried most about is that not, I mean, for obvious reasons, but then what I feel like is that a lot of Americans, regardless of whether they consider themselves as aligned with Black Lives Matter movement or not, will go and protest. And that the opposition will use the moniker of Black Lives Matter and Antifa to somehow name these groups of people and actually use real physical violence, military and so forth, to go and literally harm people and cost lives. And I think that is likely to happen if there is a Trump win. And then we see weaponization, the way that slogans can be weaponized. And I feel that, like, at least by the opposition, Black Lives Matter in that sense is going to be weaponized in the immediate future, one way or another. And that has nothing to do with the organization at all and what they're about, who they are, anything like that. But it's interesting to see how it will be used, and I don't necessarily see a particularly positive way in which this is going to play out in the next couple of weeks. But maybe that's my little scary, fearful
No, me too.
perspective. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then it's just a continuation of the racism in America that since 1619, right? 400 years, in the way in which this becomes, I think that Trump in some ways is the, as Ta-Nehisi called him, the first white president, in the sense of his very, in our times at least, his embracing of white nationalist and white supremacist ideologies. And I think we're going to see that get played out in this election, no matter who wins, one way or another. And how that is going to be narrated and what it's going to look like is something to definitely watch. And I think that then Black Lives Matter, whether they want to or not, are going to have to play a part in where the dice fall, in a sense.
Michelle?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of those sentiments. I think that, obviously we need a national leader who wants to unify the nation. We need a national leader who is responsible and who wants to calm sentiments and reassure people, and also assure people that he or she is willing to include everybody and is everyone's president and is working for the greater good of society. And that's the candidate we need. And I think the fact that so many Republicans, very late, I should say, I would love to see them jumping ship 4 years ago, right after his election, but extremely late, a month before, 2 months before the election, very prominent Republicans, not all of them most of them are not elected officials. They have served in other capacities, but prominent Republicans are coming out and saying they're going to support the Democratic ticket. So that's great. I'm glad they're doing that. I really wish that they had spoken up, 1 year, 6 months into the administration. There have been ample opportunities where we have sorely, dearly missed their voices. But okay, that's great. They hope maybe they can motivate other Republicans of conscience to also vote for a leader who is going to try to repair the damage that has been caused in the country, and also to, internationally in the, foreign relations as well. But the real problems, I think it's going to get very tense before it finally settles. I think the coming months are going to be very tense, and I'm very concerned about the militias. I'm very concerned about the white nationalists as well. I'm concerned about any groups who promote violence, because we have a lot of weapons running around the streets of the United States. So I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned about violence. And I think because Black Lives Matter is so visible right now, the movements for Black lives, and because the so-called racial reckoning process is so visible right now, I think that's going to be a natural target. And we already have evidence. We've already seen since the summer the use of force and this mentality that the federal government has, or not even the federal government, but the president has, that it's okay to use the National Guard or the military to suppress protest. And there's this too little differentiation between who is doing violence in a context of protest and who is doing peaceful protest. We see that that's a problem. We know that it's been very difficult for some people to distinguish between who are protesters and who are violent agitators. And unfortunately, there's a lot of spin on both sides, but there's ample evidence that the majority of the protests have been peaceful, and that the violence that has erupted in the context or in the vicinity of protests is often not related to the protest. So again, I think we just have to, those of us who can stay calm, I mean, I'm here, so I feel like this is all theoretical, what I have to say about it, but I'm hoping that the people who are most affected, who are living there, can stay safe and can contribute to calm and to dialogue. Yeah.
Good. I wonder if we should open it, we have a little bit of time left.
Sure.
Maybe we open it up for any possible questions from the audience. I think we have a microphone. I think the thing about weapons, I just saw a figure about this in the United States. There's 120 guns for every 100 Americans.
That's
which
about right.
is-
I know people who have multiple guns. Sure.
Which is far, far more. When you look at the list, there's lists of other countries in this. It's pretty staggering. Yes?
Yeah, I heard you say that Black Lives Matter is global, including Africa, that it's been around for centuries, that slave rebellions were about Black Lives Matter. I'm grateful to Tisdel for explaining the sort of Norwegian grievances that have been there the whole time, so that Norwegians don't need to use American discourses, but arguably they are. Black Lives Matter is an American hashtag made by Americans about American events, and one of the things that I find interesting is the timing of all this, because there is something new and different in 2020 in terms of who goes to the protests, and then just the globalization of that umbrella. So I'm wondering, why 2020? Why not 2014, 16, or 18? What's different this year? Was the video of George Floyd that much worse than, for example, the video of Walter Lamar Scott? Is it because everyone's on social media because of the pandemic and paying more attention that way? I mean, why now, I guess is my question. Why does it go global in 2020?
I have to say, I really don't know. I don't know. I think all of the factors you mentioned have influenced it, and I think a general sense of unrest being slightly, this moment that we're in, we're all experiencing, there's more connection, I think, in the world, of course, because of social media and the internet, and et cetera, but also we have this pandemic, which is also connecting us in real time. We're all having very similar experiences at the same time, and we feel, and the climate and a bunch of things that keep reminding us that we are a global community. We live on the same planet, we cohabitate, and that we're actually the same Homo sapien, acting out and behaving often in similar ways. We just have different addresses. But we seem to be reproducing the same social structures and dynamics. No matter where we are, there's oppression, there's conflict, et cetera, et cetera. We're being a Homo sapien, in our little pocket of the world, doing the same thing. So I think people can identify with some of these universal experiences of inclusion, exclusion, et cetera, et cetera. That's my take on it. But I don't know if there's one reason why, per se. What about you guys?
I completely agree. I think Trump has a lot to do with it, but I think there are so many factors playing into it that it's very hard to pinpoint exactly why. And in most cases, like when people were killed on camera, I think the smugness was a little bit absent. But in George Floyd's case, I don't know, like all you need to do is see the policeman's face, and then all you need to do is see the Asian policeman's, nonchalance to what is going on, So I think there are just so many things that played into it. I don't think it's just the one thing. I completely agree with Michelle.
Yeah,
Good.
I agree with them. And I keep asking myself that question, and I don't know the answer to it, but it just seemed like one of those moments in history, they have these critical events moments where so many different elements come together and just like, but I do agree with, I think that specific video, I like earlier that you mentioned that a lot of this is very emotional, and that emotion is not something that should be taken out of the conversation, but is actually central to any kind of civil rights struggles and so forth. It's all about emotion on both, even racists, right? They have all their like hatred and anger. Those are emotions. But I think what you were talking about with this video, and a lot of things we have on video, you get like someone who's shot. There's this way in which it just kind of happens. It happens quickly. There's something about the length of time that it took to kill a man on camera that people were watching that I think really somehow, even though it has existed, it really drove it home in a way that perhaps other images didn't. And like you said, the nonchalance, the look on Chauvin's face, literally the length of time, someone calling for his mother in their last moments. There was something about the sort of cinematic moment, if to even call it that really, like, I think really somehow sparked this incredibly emotional response in a huge group of people.
Maybe we have time for one more question?
Can you hear me? Yes, okay. So first of all, thank you very much for a very excellent conversation. It's a pleasure to listen to all of you. I was wondering, because as we've seen, and as you have said, this work has been done so many years before, right? People have been on the ground. There has been little attention so far within specific circles, yes, but what is different this year is that it's really reached out to the public, the majority society. There is interest and engagement there. So I was wondering, could you just elaborate a bit more on how can we actually make use of this momentum and go beyond, as you say, the protesting, and go into actual implementation of changes that give justice to those grievances that are expressed and those injustices that are happening still?
Well, I think, beyond the protest, but the protest did actually change a lot of things. So when I say protests are nice, but we need to do more, a lot of things were changed in many states in the US after the protests. So the protests are important, but in terms of going beyond measurable change, I think everybody has to do their part within their respective fields. I think that's the best way to go about it, because I don't think, just like being an anti-racist activist is not going to change anything. It's like you have to do it within the field you're in, and I think everyone has to be in the game. It's not just a black people's fight. This is everybody's fight. So I think everybody has to do it like where they can. But if you want to add something else.
Yes, I go back to dialogue and to into sharing information and trying to refocus the conversation on the information that's going to increase our understanding and awareness. And I particularly want to say, in this whole conversation about anti-racism and about belonging in society, we forget to mention the fact that there's no such thing as race. Race is a social construct. Race is not a biological fact. So we need to reintroduce into the conversation that race is an idea, like unicorns, right? Have you ever seen a unicorn? No, but we all know what a unicorn is, don't we? We can draw it. I use that emoji all the time. It's my favorite one. It's just an idea, but it's an idea that we've made into a reality. And it had a biological base. It was taken from biology. And if we go back to biology, we can start changing the conversation, because now biology has told us that race doesn't exist. We're one species. So we just need to reintroduce the right kind of facts into the conversation and get people talking about the fact that you can change your ideas, we can change how we think of who's in the in group, who's in the out group. We know that as well. Psychology tells us that, Robert Sapolsky talks, there's lots of brain and neuroscience that tells us that there are ways to change our ideas and to recalibrate how we think of who is in an in-group, who is in an out-group. And if we understand that these notions of in-groups and out-groups have an evolutionary function that used to keep us safe, so that we knew who was in our family group and who was outside our family group, but that they don't serve us anymore. We need to reintroduce the right kind of facts and refocus the dialogue so that we can walk ourselves out of this situation. And it's a long walk.
Oh, sure. One more question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for what you have shared. I was wondering, it's an open question, if you could say something about the connection between the Black Lives Matter movement and the climate justice movement, or the colonialism and ecological crisis. Yes, would you elaborate on that, please?
I guess I could say
I haven't studied that specifically, but I do remember reading an article in The Guardian some weeks ago where many, like Michelle was pointing out, Black Lives Matter refers to many different groups. That's one of the interesting things actually about Black Lives Matter. It's not an organization or even umbrella organization where there's like a single leader and much has been made out of that regarding Black Lives Matter. And some group was talking about that these two are more or less the same fight, right? So I think in some ways the structure that I was just talking about could be very interesting with not having like that single leader, but having different groups respond to both climate crises and the way they connect to people's ideas about inclusion and exclusion and whose environment matters, right? These kinds of questions, I think, are going to come together more and more the more crises that we come to see. And I mean, there's already many examples of communities of color, especially in the United States and elsewhere, who have had to deal with more problems with drinking water, more problems with soil erosion and groundwater. So these have always, in a way, been connected. If you think of Native Americans and their rights and the way that is also connected to climate crisis, when you have oil pipelines going through native lands and so forth, that whose lives matter will be very much connected to the land that they occupy. So I see that as something that's definitely going to become more and more connected in the larger public sphere as we move on.
I've done a little bit of research recently on some of these connections about extreme weather and minority groups in the United States. And it definitely is the case that it's indigenous people, it's African Americans, it's other people of color who are hurt the worst.
Yeah.
If we look at Hurricane Katrina in 2005, even back to the Mississippi flood in 1927, it's poorer minority communities that don't have the resources. And this is just going to continue into the future without serious kind of mitigation efforts.
So the climate struggle is the struggle for Black Lives Matter in its sort of larger concept, I think.
Can I add something? The thing is, the environment, like you said, people of color are the people that are usually mostly affected, but then things that we don't get reported often in our media is that there are a lot of things happening in the African continent, where people that are, in very poor communities, they are suffering because of the climate change. So if you really look at it, as a consequence of the climate change, the people that are going to suffer the most are the people in the poorest communities, in the poorest countries, because when you have money, you have power, and there are some things that you can do to better your situation. You can move. You have freedom of movement if you have a Western passport. A lot of people in Asia and Africa and South America don't have that kind of privilege. So, and I think the climate change movement, anyway, there are people in different continents that are doing it, but most of the times we have to also remember that people have time to fight for environments because they have the privilege of doing so. And a lot of people of color and POC communities actually are fighting for basic rights, which is kind of like a prioritization thing, because then when you have, the time to protest against other things, like here I can be an activist against, environments and other things, but maybe if I was in a different location, maybe not.
I will defer, because I thought someone was there another question or something? I don't have to add anything to that. I could, but I won't. Trying to be, yes.
I think that's just for time. But if you'd please join me in thanking Rahwa, Michelle, and Rebecca for their wonderful comments in this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.